Today is Peace Day. Happy International Day of Peace to everybody. It was so wonderful waking up this morning and reminding myself that this is really the day to re anchor, remember that peace is available to me, it's available to my mind, and that drawing upon those powers, I can also help more readily to bring peace into the world. And it's been a long journey and a long practice for me, and to be in community with all of you is quite an honor and a privilege that I don't take lightly. Thank you all for joining in community today. And I want to honor our friends John and Sophia, who were really the drivers of us offering something for Peace Day, at which point we put together this peace lecture, and it will be neat to see if we continue to offer peace lectures on a monthly basis throughout the year. This is really an opportunity for us to be in community and think about these great uh, ideals and how we practice them. And so my sense is, why not? Really, why not? Because Peace Day should be every day.
Mm.
I think also in honor of our beautiful environment and planet and cosmos, we are in the fall equinox today as well. So it's a very aligned and auspicious Peace Day. So now I want to introduce my friend Michael Nagler. Um, Many of you know him. Michael is somebody deeply dedicated to discovering peace within himself and helping others to access that and find it. And many of you know that already. He's a mentor to many of us. And author, so in that search for peace and nonviolence, he's an author. He helped create a program at UC Berkeley called Peace and Conflict Studies. He writes books, he does talks, he co-hosts my radio show, Nonviolence Radio. He's he's always there for a conversation if you need him. There's so much I could say about Michael, but I guess just this personal touch this morning is really where I feel most called. So, Michael, why don't you tell us about peace? And we have about an hour together.
All right, Stephanie, thank you. I had a little experience yesterday, which was like a peaceable kingdom experience. Outside my window here, there's a short stairway, and in the corner of that stairway in the side of the building, there is a doe who is usually settled down there, chewing her cud or whatever they do. It's beautiful. Beautiful animals, and the deer around our property here have grown up with us, so they're not very frightened. You can walk past them on the path and they don't even pick their heads up. But I didn't want to disturb this deer, and I have a chair out there where I like to go and read. And so I looked out yesterday morning and I saw she wasn't there. So no problem. I went out and sat in my chair, started to read a book by a Turkish woman, but wasn't particularly peace oriented. But then I saw something out of the corner of my eye, and I turned around, and there she was, the doe. She was sitting there with those big, beautiful black eyes of her, looking right into mine with just a hint of anxiety. They're like she was saying, "No false moves, okay?" And that lasted quite a long time. It seemed like just a very, very nice atmosphere to be thinking about peace in. Eventually, I thought, why don't I get up and walk across the meadow and pick her an apple and bring it back? But by the time I got back with the apple, she was gone. I like to think that her idea was, well, if Michael's not here, no point in me hanging around. But it may have been a more mundane explanation than that. But in any case, it was a beautiful moment. When Stephanie and I talked about this talk today, which I'm not calling a lecture, by the way. I'm allergic to lectures. I gave them for 40 years, enough. But she and I were talking about a play written by the Greek comedian, and ancient Greek comedians, like modern comedians today, often could be very serious. They use the platform of comedy to bring across very serious points. And Aristophanes wrote a play. There are 11 of his plays survive, and this one is called Irene, which gives us the modern name Irene. I don't think we have an Irene on the call right now. And Irene means peace. I'm going to talk about the limitations of that word in just a minute. But in this highly imaginative play, Aristophanes was always very funny and highly imaginative. Peace is a goddess, and that's kind of normal in the ancient world for any important element of human life to be a god or a goddess. And the problem is play was written in the middle of the Peloponnesian War, which was a grinding, hideous conflict, something like what's going on in Gaza right now, only lower technology. And this expressed the heartfelt wish of many in Greece, Athens, and in Peloponnese, both parts of the country, for peace. And the way he did it in his imaginative way was to think of peace as a goddess. And in the ancient world, there's almost no difference between the goddess and the statue that you worship representing that goddess. Kind of a very Indian thing, actually. And all the Greeks get together and put a rope around the statue, and they're going to drag peace out of the cave. And when she's out of the cave, peace will happen. But two things go wrong. First of all, some people start to quarrel. Instead of pulling their share, they say, "You're pulling more. You're not doing your share." And other people say, "I'm doing my share." And then something even more damaging to the project happens, which is they decide to celebrate. And this struck me as very modern. Let's celebrate peace. She's not even halfway out of the cave yet. And they stop pulling on the ropes and they're dancing and singing, "We've got peace. Isn't this wonderful?" And then the hero of the play has to remind them, "Get back to work, people. We're not there yet." And I think that's very timely. And this morning, there's a website called Campaign Nonviolence, and it has quotes every day. And today's quote is appropriately from Martin Luther King. And he said, "We must concentrate not merely on the negative expulsion of war, but the positive affirmation of peace." And that's going to be kind of the theme of this non-lecture that I want to share with you this morning. But before we get into peace proper, I want to say something about the idea of having a celebratory day. And that's why I introduced that episode from Aristophanes' play. I think having, Mother's Day or Father's Day or Peace Day is highly ambiguous. It does help in a way to acknowledge and elevate something. And I'll show in a minute, this could be really important for peace in particular. But it also, for some people, and it depends on how you address it, for some people, it's a way of compartmentalizing and setting aside the thing that you're, quote, celebrating. So if Peace Day is September 21st, and the fact that this designation of distinct times can be ambivalent was actually quite significant during the Upper Middle Ages, say from in the West from the 12th century onward. Church authorities tried to bring about what we would call a ceasefire. They call it trux or truce between warring lord nobles. and nobles could think of nothing better to do than to recruit peasants and buy horses and armor and attack other nobles and take over their land and their castles, stuff like that. They were doing that all the time. So the church felt that this was weakening Christendom, not to say, smudging the reputation a little bit, not to mention that this religion is supposed to have been started by the Prince of Peace, who sacrificed himself rather than harm others. And so they decided to have what they call a trux dei, or in the plural, trutes dei. And they thought, I mean, some of them thought anyway, that what they could do is like set aside a week or like Easter week or around Christmas time, maybe a little more than a week. And some of them thought that once you establish that beachhead, pardon the expression, you could expand it. Once people got a taste for not fighting, they would not want to go back to fighting. But alas, that was a naive assessment of human psychology, especially male psychology. And in fact, what the Trutes Dei actually led to was an opportunity for people to recover from wounds, rearm, train, and go back in with a vengeance. The Trux Dei had the same kind of emotional flaw to it than the idea of not eating certain forbidden foods on given days. Like on Lent, we will not eat meat the rest of the year. It's fine. I hope I'm not offending anybody. Those things have their usefulness. Similarly, it occurred to me when I was teaching religion at Berkeley, I always said I was the chair of the religious studies department for my many sins. We hit upon the idea that having a day set aside when you went to church had the same kind of ambivalence that people could exploit, and that defined the difference between, broadly speaking, religion and spiritual practice. When you start to practice your religion every day, instead of one day a week, it starts to become a spiritual practice. Because really, if you try to meditate occasionally, you'll quickly discover that it is excruciatingly difficult and you lose, in one day you can lose 7 days worth of practice if you're not meditating. So, like religion, and they're very closely aligned, I think peace is something has to be made our life. It has to be made every minute of every day and not set aside these days. So now that I've dissed Peace Day that we're all supposed to be celebrating, let me think for a minute with you about how we should observe the day. And I think it's by rededication, dedicating ourselves with even more commitment to, as Stephanie was saying, working on bringing about this state. First of all, this is some advantage of modern period, some breakthrough that we have made in the modern period, the recognition that peace has to begin within the human being, where there are, and St. Augustine, I think, was the first who recognized this and spoke to it at great length here in the West. And I'm speaking to you from the west of the West. I'm about 6 miles from the Pacific Ocean at this point. The idea that peace, in order to be real, cannot be compartmentalized, and that hangs together with the problem that I noted a little bit earlier. If you look at the vocabulary with which peace was described until the time of Augustine, the late third, early fourth century of our era. And this was brought to my attention in a book, in case you're interested, by an Italian scholar whose name was Zampiglioni. Very nice name. And the book was called The Idea of Peace in Antiquity. And he pointed out something which I may have noticed unconsciously, but I hadn't made conscious note of, that in both Greek and Latin, the words for peace only mean arrangement. The Greek word eirene that I mentioned before comes from a verb are, where we get articulate from, and are a joint. The verb in Greek is arorisko. And the Latin word which is so celebrated today, pax, means a pact. So, in other words, neither the Greek nor the Latin traditions acknowledged peace as a permanent, as the possibility of peace as a permanent condition. Instead, they acknowledge what the 12th century clerics were going to acknowledge, that peace is only a cessation of war. The profound significance of this is that war is regarded then as the underlying reality of human existence. And of course, in the West, this was emphasized by Darwin and Freud and that whole school of thought, which now, of course, fortunately has been disproven and set aside in the minds of some people, at least. So there is a profound metaphysical shift that we need to go through in our own mind and in society at large. And that is the acknowledgement that peace is the real. Peace is the underlying condition. And if you want a beautiful, beautiful statement about that, using the term satyagraha, or clinging to truth, look at the end. I think I've got this right now. Look at the end of chapter 10 of Gandhi's Satyagraha in South Africa, where he defines this beautifully, and he says, and that is the doctrine of Satyagraha in a nutshell. Now, I mentioned before St. Augustine. Oh, but I'm sorry, let me get back to the discussion I started with those two terms, Latin and Greek. They really lead to some, not sure whether the terms cause the misunderstanding or the misunderstanding caused the terms like an essentialist argument or not. But in any case, pax, for example, in Latin, leads to the idea of the pax Romana, which is a horrible example. It actually, pax Romana, if you're not familiar with the term, actually means a state of domination in which others are completely suppressed. This is what, unfortunately, Israelis, or Israel as a nation state, wants to do to the Palestinians, to hold them down to where they're helpless and can't fight back to any significant degree, and that we might call the Pax Judaica, or more accurately, Pax Israelitica. So this negative piece, to introduce that term, leads to the idea of a Pax Romana, and you have the very wise historian Tacitus, in his histories, has a famous statement: they make a desert and call it peace. In other words, now, this comes back to, but this is, let me put it this way, this is contrasted with the Hebrew word shalom, which, Ellen, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it goes back to a root meaning of wholeness, of health, and the Sanskrit word shanti, which is a really the primary meaning of shanti is that state of deep inner peace. Is that all I can call it? And now, Augustine's discussion of peace, I think, is, as far as I am aware, it's the first time in the West that we have anything more than lip service paid to peace, and the first time also that makes us break through to realize the profound primary significance of it. And this comes from his tremendous work, The City of God, the full title being this Civitas Dei contra Paganos, the City of God against the pagans. So it was not really the totally holistic concept of peace that we're leading our way up to. And it reminds me of a festival that was being held in a park somewhere recently in the Midwest. And they said, "We don't want any fascists in here because this is a park for everyone." Stop and think about that a little bit. It's not going to hold up for very long. But he was the first, I believe, to point out that peace is a primary reality. And he has this famous image. He was a brilliant rhetorician, and he has this famous image to bring this out. He said, just as we can have health without illness, but you cannot talk about illness without some idea of health. Similarly, we can have peace without war, but no war that does not presuppose some kind of peace. And that sounds unrealistic at first, but then he goes and illustrates it. He says, well, take the case of somebody. Now, there's one exception in nature. Actually, he points out wolverines are angry at everybody all the time. That's their outlook on life. But human beings have the capacity to be very different. And he points out that even in people who wage war, they do so in the hope, the vain hope, of permanently eliminating a source of perturbation, turbulence, disruption, so that they can have what they will call peace. But as Augustine points out, and I'm quoting him now, the trouble with peace, quote, is that even on the level of earthly and temporal values, that is not talking about eternal peace in the beyond, even on the level of earthly and temporal values, nothing that we can talk about, long for, or finally get is so desirable, so welcome, so good as peace. Peace is so universally loved that its very name falls sweetly on the ear. I'm sorry, I usually do choke up a little bit when I read that definition. So this is in Book 19, Section 11 of The City of God. As you see, you can get Nagler out of the university, but you cannot get the university out of Nagler, clearly. So there I am giving you the reference. Now, to throw this was emphasized by two great thinkers in the West, Immanuel Kant, who in 1805 wrote Zum ewigen Frieden, or Perpetual Peace. And he starts off by underscoring the danger of misinterpreting peace in the very negative way that I was talking about just now. He says he had just walked past the churchyard near his home, and on many tombstones you see Zum ewigen Frieden, going to eternal peace. And what he has to fight against is this idea that peace is an absence, a negativity, in fact, a state that closely resembles death. And then the Jewish Dutch philosopher Baruch Spinoza comes along a couple of hundred years later, and he says he definitively replaced the idea that peace is the absence of war, finally. He said peace is not the absence of war, it's a disposition for amity, for justice, and so forth. Now, I know you're eagerly on the edges of your seats, wondering when I'm going to tell you my definition of peace. So be patient, friends, it is coming. I just wanted to point out that this is precisely the struggle that we have gone through lo these many years with the concept of nonviolence. In the English language, we're stuck with this negative term, which at first was even hyphenated. And even if you go back beyond nonviolence proper, which was coined in the 1920s, back 100 years in 1815, you had a Methodist minister. In fact, I think he was probably the founder of Methodism. Aidan Ballou was his name, and he wrote a book, 1815, called Christian Non-Resistance in All Its Important Bearings Explained and Defended. They loved long explanatory titles in those days. That's what subtitles are for today. But anyway, notice that he identified not the absence of violence with religion, and that again, he was describing it in the negative as non-resistance, the absence of resistance. So this is what we've been fighting against, and the US Navy has not made our job any easier. I don't know if you have these billboards where you live, but where I live, for a while, there were these billboards. That's the closest I ever came to vandalism, actually. There were billboards with a big picture of a battleship or cruiser or something like that. Yeah, and it said, life, liberty, and the pursuit of those who would threaten it. So there is to be no happiness in this world. There is to be perpetual enmity. And sure enough, in the sometime in the 1950s, the U.S. Navy attempted to give its definition of peace. And its definition, ta-da, was perpetual pre-hostility. How inspiring is that? Not at all. It is in total contrast to that we have Augustine in the ancient world and Gandhi in our own. And I am leading up to the idea that we want to talk about, which is what is the definition, the relationship between peace and nonviolence. And that, let me say something about it now, is that in our modern usage of the terms, first of all, to back up and say, I think there really is no difference whatever between the two phenomena. They are just being looked at in different arenas. So we tend to look at peace primarily as an international phenomenon. And interestingly enough, that's where it kind of shades off into a negative. And we tend to look at nonviolence partly for historical reasons, partly because we had the geniuses of Gandhi and King and others who developed it as something that does, in fact, begin within the human being. Whereas in the way we misuse the term peace is to apply it first and foremost, and then eventually to apply it only in the international, that is, in the military arena. And that's where we go back to a Latin mantram, I guess you might call it, which was si vis pacem para bellum. In other words, if you want peace, prepare for war. And sure enough, hundreds of years later, here we have the motto that was very popular and very offensive some 30 or 40 years ago, I think, which is peace through strength. And Ronald Reagan, President Reagan, really fond of that phrase and promoted it a lot. Peace through strength, where strength means, and you never identify, you can never define it, that's not allowed. But what it really means is the ability to hurt others, make them do what you want. So peace through that kind of strength. So one of the first articles that I wrote when I finally was reborn out of classics and into peace studies. I called it strength through peace. In other words, it's dedication to peace that makes us strong, not vice versa. Incidentally, you may have noticed a very subtle in Stephanie's voice when she talked about the program that we founded at Berkeley called Peace and Conflict Studies. And thereon hangs a tale, actually. We decided, myself and a few colleagues, a radical bunch of lefties who mostly hung out off campus, drinking coffee and plotting the revolution. We decided to move our revolution right onto the campus and found a program in peace studies. And while we were doing this, a person, a guy who really knew the politics of the campus came in and said, "You'll never get anywhere, friends. Peace studies, no, no one will have it. You have to call it peace and conflict studies." So we did that, but actually the joke was on them because the acronym of peace and conflict studies was PAX. So just a little comic relief here. Uh, the students one year who were graduating from the PAX program, and we were in fact the first degree granting program in peace studies, I'm pretty sure, in the US. That was not in an actual peace college, like Earlham or one of those. So we were very proud of that. And the students had kind of a joke at graduation. They said, "What is the difference a PAX degree and a cheese pizza?" And of course, this stumps everyone. And they said, "A cheese pizza can feed a family of four." The joke here is that when we wanted to start peace, or okay, peace and conflict studies at the university, our colleagues were very much opposed to the idea. They were kind of outraged, partly because there is very little money to go around at the young university. Now, of course, there's even less, thanks to the new administration. And we had to promise that we wouldn't require a penny, which turned out not to be true. You can't do anything without any money. But they were also worried about it from other points of view. Like one of them in a meeting we were having said, "You're just opposed to American foreign policy." Who was giving the talk presentation, I was kind of stumped that one of my colleagues, God bless him, he stood up and he said, "Are you saying that American foreign policy is a war policy?" The guy was absolutely stumped. I could have kissed my colleague. That was just such a beautiful stretch, because that is, of course, exactly what the underlying idea is. And on one level, I can appreciate this. When I was growing, I don't have bad dreams anymore. That's one thing I owe to meditation. But before I started meditating, which was really a long time, I used to have bad dreams. And in these bad dreams, I was being traced by a giant. Okay, this is primordial, it goes back to the birth of the human race, probably before. But in my case, it did have a particular application because I was and still am physically quite small. And my father was, 5'11" and weighed in at 230 pounds. Okay, he was a very kind person. He never struck any of us, but he did have a lot of anger that was bottled up. And so I had this dream where I was being chased by this giant. I mean, you didn't sign up for a psychoanalytic session here, so I'll try to get over this quickly. And to protect myself, defend myself against this overwhelming threat, I had a revolver and I went to try to shoot the giant, and the darn thing wouldn't fire. It jammed. So, why am I sharing all of these gruesome personal, almost psychosomatic details with you? Because we have to appreciate that when we talk about peace, the majority of human beings are panic stricken because they think what you're doing is taking away their ability to defend themselves in a violent, hostile world. So, our job is to show them that's not what peace means. And this is what I mean by rededicating ourselves today. In the first instance, to understand peace in its full depth. And so we've been waiting for this. You know, you've been very patient. You've been waiting for my definition of peace. Here it is. I would say peace obtains in any system where all participants spontaneously desire the other's welfare. If anybody in a given entity, system, unit, what do you call it, wants everybody else to thrive, to be fulfilled, that is a state that we can call peace. And I admit here that I'm taking off against, I'm inverting the famous definition of violence by a great mentor of mine and one of the two founding scholars of peace science in the West, Johann Galtung, who defined violence as the unnecessary infringement of human needs. Therefore, what I am emphasizing over and above what Johann said comes from my understanding of the word ahimsa, which we translate nonviolence in Latin. Yes, or in Sanskrit. Because there are two things about ahimsa that I think people who translate it as nonviolence, especially people who translate it as non-dash violence, the absence of overt conflict, don't realize about that word. First of all, in the beginning means this is a negative, like a dharma or a whatever in English. And yes, it is a negative, but there is an implication behind it that doesn't come across in English, and that is that there are some concepts that are regarded as so profound that they cannot be directly described, almost like the concept of God himself. The best that you can do is delete its negation. That's one idea. That don't think that ahimsa is really a negative term in the sense that it would be a negative term for us. Okay, I know this isn't something that's been bothering you for a long time, but just to set the record straight. The other part of the word that I want to stress is even more significant. Himsa comes from a root hun, which means to hit. In fact, you can tell the way I'm illustrating this that it's kind of an onomatopoetic word. To hit, to strike, to slay. And how do you get from hun to hins or himsa? It's what we call, and I promise you this is the last bit of intellectualizing we're trying to do, I hope. It is what we call a desiderative. In other words, it doesn't mean hitting. Himsa doesn't mean hitting. It means the desire to hit. So there you have it. That ahimsa really means the state of consciousness that arises when all desire to injure is absent, let's say. However, it gets to be absent. I would say it's been converted, it's been translated into a creative energy, which is something that we've come to understand in the modern world. there you have it. Peace is that system in which all participants spontaneously desire the other's welfare. And this starts to hang together, as it should and as it must, with the concept of who are we? And here we come to a very helpful but not yet really exploited shift in consciousness that takes place starting about 40 years ago, which is the recognition that the concept of the human being, which was given to us first by our misunderstanding and stereotyping of Darwin. I used to say it's caused by Darwin, but it wasn't. It was caused by the way we misread him. And after that, more directly by Freud, that primordially we still live in a state of perpetual pre-hostility toward one another, a state of competition for scarce resources, and that defines human life. And fortunately, modern science has found that this is not the underlying modality of being, but that rather all beings desire one another's welfare. Who'd have thought? So that's where, on the negative side, we have this concept of moral injury, which is so prevalent among servicemen and women that even those who have not been directly involved in injuring another, but just been, say, sitting at a console, sending drones somewhere, are coming down with a version of a subset, if you will, of PTSD, which has been it's taken a long time to understand because of our disoriented view of human beings. We're all competitive in a brutal struggle for resources of every kind. Then it should be perfectly natural for us to want to suppress, eliminate, dominate others. But in fact, when we do that, we get sick. And there's a very good book that I'll recommend, one of several I'm going to recommend before I finish. And it's by a woman scholar whose last name is Denton-Borhog. There we are with hyphenated nouns again, Denton-Borhog. And the title of the book is And Then Your Soul Is Gone. Because it is remarkable how these poor guys, and sometimes women also, who come back traumatized by conflict, and where you recognize and they can learn to recognize that they've been more traumatized by what they have done, not by what has been done to them. They can be very brave and can endure, can function under fire beautifully. In fact, that there are certain physiological processes that kick in, including camaraderie with others, that kick in when you're threatened, but they can then, 20 years later, suffer from some otherwise unexplained symptoms of things that they may have done. And that recurred to them over and over again. And I know my uncle, whom I really adored because he was a very tall, very handsome man, opposite of me in every respect. And he was in the Navy. And years and years after that experience, he could never forget an episode that took place where a Japanese fighter plane, he was on an aircraft carrier and he was an officer. A Japanese plane was attacking the ship. They shot it down. They blew up the plane, and the pilot parachuted out. So there he was. You have like 500 men watching this Japanese soldier come slowly swinging down to the water. And I won't quote his exact words, but my uncle gave the command to kill him. And they did. And here you are, 20, 30 years later, he's still telling us this story. You know, he was otherwise a healthy man. But at least from this negative perspective, we've begun to realize that it is not within our nature to harm others. From a positive perspective, it has been recognized more and more recently that we come to life when when we serve the well-being of others. Duh, just what Galtung was talking about. And one anecdote that I really like to share here is something that happened, I think it was in 1992. There was a very bad tsunami. It was an earthquake, and a very bad tsunami hit the east coast of India. I was actually there and saw some of the results 20 years later. It was pretty impressive. And an American serviceman, it was a Marine, I believe, was a submarine sergeant. He was in Sri Lanka, and he was given the job of handing out food supplies to villagers whose homes and crops and everything had been washed away. And this was a long day's boring work, just, here, here, here. And somebody came to him at the end of the day and said, "How do you feel about doing this work? This isn't what you were trained for." And he said, "I have been," and he used the quote sign, "serving my country for 32 years." And sorry. And this is the first day I ever got any satisfaction out of it. So there we have it. I mean, this is a profound recognition of who we really are. Yes, Stephanie, yes, I'm getting ready to wrap up. She can't do these things without her. And this robust, positive understanding of peace is developing in parallel with our understanding of who we are as human beings. And I like to just throw in a little complaint about my very poor education. The one time I was given any definition, if you will, of who I was as a human being was when our biology teacher said, "I am a primate with flat fingernails." Okay, you look down, by golly, they're flat, but it didn't seem to help any in understanding who we are. No, what we need to understand primordially about us is that we are all part of one another. And that in the deepest layer or stratum of our nature, we are one, and we cannot injure another. As it says, chapter 13 of the Bhagavad Gita, once you have seen that you are in everyone and everybody is you, how can self injure self? How can there be violence anymore? So let me just close by recommending a few books. One is by a colleague of mine from San Diego called Mary E. Clark. There is a Marine captain, I think, also by the name of Mary E. Clark, but this is not the one I'm talking about. She was a biology teacher at San Diego, and she wrote a book called The Search for Human Nature. And in it, she extended the old trifecta of what human beings need, food, clothing, and shelter, and said, yeah, that's what we need as physical entities, as sort of animals, if you will. But to be fully human, we need bonding, autonomy, and freedom. And I love that definition because bonding and autonomy are in a very creative paradox with one another. I've got to be, and Martin Luther King said this beautifully, I've got to be precisely who I am. As a friend of mine puts it, a evolving spiritual being in order to be fully at one with the rest of you. And I don't want any of you to be me, God forbid, any sense of the word. Be precisely who you are. And paradoxically, we will be more at one that way than if we try to imitate uniformity on the surface. So bonding, autonomy, and freedom. Then there were two ethologists or students of animal and human behavior who have both happened to be Dutch. Frans de Waal, D-E space W-A-A-L, and a colleague of his, Rutger, R-U-D-G-E-R, Bregman, who've written new books, Human Nature. Frans de Waal, of course, is quoted and interviewed in our film, which, if you hang on, you'll be seeing in a little while. And they give you the science, the proving it from every scientific animal, from every scientific angle on every animal, that we are human, as Ubuntu says, we are human insofar as we are in community. And then I've been recently reading a book by a fellow New Yorker, Sebastian Junger, who, with other scholars, has, like E.F. Schumacher, wrote a book. His first book was called Small is Beautiful, and that was a shockingly anti-American concept. I'm sure no copies of it were sold in Texas. Small is Beautiful. And then he went on to write a book called Good Work, and to show, once again, that human beings cannot be fulfilled without meaning, without significant work, which is in service of the whole. Okay, well, I'll just close by mentioning one kind of a sidelight on this. Where do we see this sense of service and the fulfillment of unity coming out? And this is where Sebastian Junger and Rebecca Solnit and others have really shown this beautifully. It comes out in disasters. It comes out in catastrophes. We think of Katrina as something like, absolutely catastrophic and horrible and all the rest of it. You ask people who live in New Orleans what it was like going through Katrina, and to your surprise, they will say, it was the best time of our life. I wish we could go back there. In other words, there is both an individual and a very powerful group tendency for groups to spontaneously, without any organization, without anyone giving orders, without any plan, mysteriously, it's like watching a murmuration of humans, if you will. We come together and save each other in catastrophes. And that gives us a feeling not only of happiness, but of realizing who we really are. So that leads us to a very simple proposition. How do we evoke that feeling all the time, even when there isn't a catastrophe? No sooner have you said that than you realize we don't have to. We're in a catastrophe. We're in a polycrisis. We're destroying the planet we live on and one another and democracy and all of those things before our very eyes. So we've got our catastrophe. But somehow, as yet, people have not reacted to it as such. They have not quite realized that we must now pull together, sacrifice all kinds of personal, individual benefits for the well-being of the whole, in which, of course, we will be benefited. So that's a little bit closer to a realization of the possibility of peace than to say we've got to stop fighting, we've got to stop hating, and just completely turn that over, pull the money, all the money out of the military budget and put it into peace studies. I'd go back to the university if they did that. I don't know if that's a threat or a promise. So, with that, I will wrap up this very lecture-like non-lecture and hand it back to you, Stephanie.